Hi, I'm Dr. Sweta Chakraborty, and welcome to the Future of Nuclear Energy, a four-part series exploring the evolving role of nuclear power in today's energy landscape. We're in our second episode. We're digging into one of the biggest questions facing the energy transition. What role, if any, should nuclear power be playing in a low-carbon future? How does it compare to other clean energy sources like wind and solar? And why do some countries embrace nuclear while others seemingly are phasing it out? And what are the trade offs we need to consider when we're thinking about building an energy system that's reliable, affordable, and sustainable? So, to help us unpack all of these questions, I am joined by Jessica Lovering, Senior Fellow at the Nuclear Innovation Alliance and an expert on energy policy and innovation. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us for episode 2 of this series.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to dig into this energy puzzle and really understand the role of nuclear in a clean energy future. And I know this is something you spend quite a lot of time thinking about. So help explain this to our audiences. Let's start with the big picture and where nuclear really fits into this clean energy mix. We know that every energy source has trade-offs, right? Whether it's cost, reliability, emissions, land use. So when we're looking to build a clean, reliable energy system for the future, where do you see nuclear fitting in relation to these trade-offs?
Yeah, I think trade-offs is really the key word there because unfortunately, there's no magical energy source that has zero environmental impact or zero social impact. And so, we focus a lot on carbon emissions today, but there's also, traditional air and water pollution, of course, but other impacts on the environment from extraction, drilling, mining for critical minerals, and also water use, water consumption, and land use. So I see just big picture that we need nuclear in the mix because we just need a diversity of low carbon energy sources so that we can fully phase out fossil fuels and decarbonize the global energy system. And I say energy system because it's not just the power sector, but transportation, industry, agriculture. And I think more importantly, what's pulling more and more climate people and more environmental people towards nuclear today is that the technology has a really proven track record of scaling up fast and displacing fossil fuels. So as we're trying to accelerate progress on mitigating climate change and reducing carbon emissions, people are rethinking nuclear's role and revisiting this technology, which we have a long history with, but hasn't always been positive.
Sure. And it's interesting what the relationship with nuclear has been in the United States. So if you could talk a little bit about that and why America is embracing nuclear more compared to also some countries which are doing more than the US for sure, but then some are also shutting plants down. So can we look at the global picture and compare it to the United States? Give us a little context there too.
Yeah, so the United States is very unique with nuclear. So really the first sort of the leader in commercial nuclear energy, um, with the most plants worldwide, about close to 100, I think like 96 reactors operating now. And we've seen a resurgence in interest in nuclear in the US in the last 10 years, I would say, and not just in the private sector. There's been a lot of interest, bipartisan interest in our government in support of nuclear. And it comes from a couple different places. I think from the Democratic Party, there's a lot of interest in its zero carbon attributes and its environmental benefits. And from the Republicans, there's much more interest in sort of energy security or energy independence, because nuclear fuel is very energy dense. It's very large scale, reliable electricity source. So I think what's driving renewed interest in nuclear in the US is different than other countries. It's a mix of climate and energy insecurity, but it really varies across different countries around the world. So some of the recent changes in trajectory, there's been a lot of variety across countries. So I can't get into all of them, but some of the really recent changes are dependent on which political parties are in power.
Sure.
But I think longer term, kind of what determines whether a country pursues nuclear power or not, and whether they phase nuclear power out or have bans on nuclear power, kind of depends on what alternatives they have. So
Sure.
if you as a country don't have a lot of domestic fossil fuels like France or Japan or the UK now, you might invest a lot more in nuclear power for energy independence primarily. Or on the flip side, if you have a lot of hydro like Norway, you probably don't need nuclear, or Switzerland. And if you have a lot of coal and powerful coal industries, coal lobbies like Germany and Australia, there are going to be a lot more forces pushing against nuclear. And so I think that explains a lot of the difference. But some of the recent changes, I think there's been some frustration on the slow progress towards decarbonization. And we're starting to see that in countries shifting their positions on nuclear. And then also a really big driver of the shift in especially Europe, but also Japan in the last 3 years has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the gas crisis in Europe. So that energy, coming back to that energy independence, energy security argument. So nuclear is a good replacement for natural gas in Europe. And so that's been driving a lot of the policy shift there
Yeah.
and
No,
renewed interest in nuclear.
sure. This makes a lot of sense. Energy independence, geopolitics, the need to meet our decarbonization goals globally. All of this is making the case for nuclear. So let's talk about the strengths, the challenges, and some comparisons to other energy sources. Do we really need nuclear, right? So could we just do this all with wind and solar? We've already established the technologies there. It's a matter of scaling it up. Where does nuclear fit into that, the context of the renewables that are already on market and are potentially less controversial?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, especially as we've seen these dramatic cost declines in particularly wind and solar in the last decade. And I want to start off by just saying, yes, I think we do still need nuclear, and I don't want to diminish the cost declines for renewables. That's really important. But renewables are cheap on a per unit of energy basis, so per kilowatt hour. But when you look at system costs, especially for a deeply decarbonized system, a fully carbon-free power system, that's when renewables are still quite expensive and where we're starting to see renewables come up against limits on how much deployment, how much they can penetrate a power grid. And so what we see in sort of the real world and in models is that having nuclear on your grid helps reduce costs, and also helps you deploy more renewables. And there's this saying that I really like, and I wish I knew where I heard it first. So if someone knows, please tell me. But
We're going to crowdsource
renewables
this.
are, okay, yes. Please give me a reference. Renewables are a very cheap way to make expensive electricity, and nuclear is a very expensive way to make cheap electricity. And how I take that is that you don't want 100% of either. You need a balance to get to this optimal system that's affordable, reliable, and zero carbon.
So allowing for that diversity and having options in a increasingly unstable future is what I'm hearing is good. It's good to have
Yeah.
options. Okay, so nuclear is maybe expensive, but it is also referred to as reliable. It's always on, and wind and solar have more variable power potentially. And then there's the cost of storage. There's the cost of how do we actually get access when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing and all of that. So when we think about reliability, how important really is it as we think about decarbonizing the grid?
Yeah. So I think, renewables advocates are starting to roll their eyes whenever someone says the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, because it's quite, it's obvious. And grid operators are very sophisticated now in how they manage the grid. And they can plan for this. They can manage some of that variability, some of that intermittency. They have forecasts, they can predict days and weeks ahead. But it is still a big challenge, that variability. And it's only going to grow as renewables penetration grows. So a lot of grids right now that have significant deployment of wind and solar also benefit from legacy fossil fuel generation. So they have a lot of gas on the grid, or they have a lot of hydro on the grid that they can use for backup. Or they have really good transmission interconnections with their neighboring grids, so they can import and export as they need. So they're sort of benefiting from that. But as you move towards a really deeply decarbonized system, you have to get rid of all that fossil backup. And so how do you have a reliable system that's 100% carbon free? So even with huge improvements in grid scale battery storage, which we've seen, and better deployment of demand response, you still need this thing that we call clean firm power. And that includes nuclear, but also hydro and geothermal. And the issue is that if you don't have that option, that clean firm power, you have to massively overbuild your renewables capacity, and not just a little bit, like by a factor of 10.
Right.
So that means if you need 10 gigawatts of capacity, you have to build 100, or maybe 200. And you also have to build out your transmission network a lot more so that you can move that power around. And that's just really expensive. And even as batteries come down in cost, you still have to have the excess electricity at times of year to charge those batteries. And it's not just storing it for a few hours. You might have to do sort of longer term storage, like seasonal, weekly storage, and that just gets really expensive. So it's doable. I think you physically could have a 100% renewable system. It's just going to be very expensive and probably a lot slower. So if we're looking at how do we decarbonize faster while maintaining affordability and reliability, having some amount of clean firm power is really important. And nuclear is really the only option that can scale. Both hydro and geothermal are pretty geographically limited right now.
So let's talk about how scaling nuclear could help with the cost, because right now it's still really perceived as too expensive or too slow to deploy. So if we can accelerate these technologies and get them to scale, what does that do to the cost conversation on nuclear? So where
Yeah.
do these conversations stand today? Because as you're saying, we've made so much progress with renewables, with wind and solar, but again, it's really expensive to get all the energy that we need just from wind and solar, as you really clearly explained to our audience. So talk to us about how we think about that as it relates to cost, as it relates to nuclear.
Yeah, and how to bring down the cost of nuclear. I think cost is a big challenge for nuclear. But I think, people often talk about cost as if it's this intrinsic property of a given technology. Like nuclear is expensive because of something, it's complicated, it's unsafe, the engineering has to be, really complicated to maintain that safety. But cost is really determined by policy, both on the supply and demand side. So going back historically, and looking at costs, which I've done a lot with nuclear, when countries were really focused on building out a fleet of nuclear, say in France and Sweden and South Korea more recently, they were able to keep the costs really low and build really fast. And so that's the result of good industrial policy, but also they had strong demand for electricity and strong growth in demand for electricity. So it's hard to build enough nuclear to see those cost declines when you have kind of stagnant demand for electricity, when you have deregulated or liberalized power markets. So we kind of need new policies to accelerate deployment of nuclear. And we're starting to see some creativity, some experimentation with that. There was a lot of new ideas coming out of the Biden-Harris administration around nuclear, but we can also just take a lot of lessons from renewables. So renewables have benefited from decades of significant policy support. In the US, there's been the investment tax credit, the production tax credit, the renewable portfolio standards, which like 30 states have, loan guarantees for manufacturing facilities, and even more, property tax exemptions, all sorts of things. And that's what drove this deployment and cost declines. It wasn't, just some intrinsic quality of renewables. But nuclear, on the other hand, for the most part, has just been competing with fossil fuels on cost, and without similar incentives and without us valuing the benefit that it has from a carbon-free perspective.
Sure.
So, nuclear has had R&D support at the basic level, but not these sort of demand pull policies that really drive deployment until quite recently. So we're starting to see production tax credits, investment tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Acts, and other countries are, especially in Europe, are starting to do similar things in terms of opening up financing and different kinds of incentives for new nuclear. So I think once we start to see those sorts of policies and sort of leveling the playing field for low carbon options, that's going to help drive down the cost of nuclear.
Sure. And there's examples of this, as you described, for other energy sources. So if we see policy favorable to nuclear, we could really see driving down of these costs. Nuclear is also seen as one of the better uses of land for to create energy with the least amount of land use. But there's some challenges that come up with that too, right? So mining, waste storage, safety buffers, and then it becomes a little bit more complicated as we think about nuclear and land use. So can you talk to us about how nuclear power compares to other clean energy sources when it comes to land use?
Yeah. So when you include everything, so you do a full life cycle assessment of the land use for electricity generation, nuclear actually still looks pretty good. And I know this because I have co-authored a study that did just this. It's in the journal PLOS One from
Yes,
2022,
you're the person
if
to talk
anyone
to.
wants to see it. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And we collected a whole bunch of data from real operating power plants from all different sources, renewables, nuclear, fossil fuels. And nuclear has the lowest land use intensity. It's much lower than renewables and fossil fuels. And that's just because the fuel is so energy dense, a million times more energy dense than hydrocarbons. And there is this kind of assumption that when you move from fossil fuels to renewables, you are going to make this trade off, that renewables just take a lot of land, but people are often willing to make that trade off. And so, that's just something, it's not maybe necessarily a technocratic decision. We live in a democracy, and so different communities are going to choose different things. Like if you have a lot of land, maybe you're okay with a large, utility scale solar farm or wind farm. But if you're in a very urban setting or, you have an industrial site that needs a lot of power, nuclear might be a much better option because it has such a tiny land footprint. Now, in some places, like I said, in the US, you may not think land is such a constraint. We have a ton of empty land, not empty, but we have a ton of land that could be available.
Sure.
But larger land requirements for a project mean more communities are impacted, more people, more ecosystems are impacted, and that leaves just a lot more opportunity for opposition. And we are seeing this happening all around the world, not just in the US, is growing opposition, or really organic opposition to renewables projects. And so I don't want to put this out there as an insurmountable obstacle. Just, there are ways to mitigate these challenges for renewables, to build community support for these projects, but it's definitely getting harder to site renewables projects. And so starting to think more about these land use constraints when you're looking at modeling future energy systems, I think is really important.
Yeah, we could definitely give examples of public pushback for renewable projects for the impact it's having on the community and on the environment, right? So again, it's one of those paradoxes, but it's something that nuclear can address from what I'm hearing from you. So
Yeah.
let's talk about various perceptions around nuclear and let's talk about public perception. We know that nuclear is more of a conversation in wealthier countries, but we know that the demand for energy is growing all over the world in the global south. So, how could nuclear support those countries in the global south? What are the barriers to really reaching those who could benefit the most from clean energy as they develop and grow as a
Yeah.
country?
So there's a lot of discussion and demand for nuclear in emerging economies already. So, just as an example, all of the BRICS countries have nuclear power. But there is this perception that nuclear is for wealthy countries. And I actually wrote this little piece for Energy for Growth Hub, where I'm also a fellow, titled "Is Nuclear Power Only for Wealthy Countries?" So to this exact question, what I found is that actually a full third of countries that have nuclear power today began their nuclear power programs when their GDP per capita was below $5,000. That's pretty low income. So this is places like China, India, Brazil. And what they were doing is starting commercial nuclear power as a means to spur industrialization, to grow their economies. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of interest in nuclear from lower income countries today, is because you need a lot of energy to do manufacturing, to reach modern standards of living. And you need something that can scale up. So there's about 30 countries right now that are pursuing nuclear power. We call them like nuclear newcomer countries or aspiring nuclear countries. You have places like Turkey, Egypt, and Bangladesh that have nuclear power plants under construction, their first nuclear power plants under construction. And really, the biggest obstacle for most of these countries is financing. They just don't have the financial resources or the ability to borrow to build these projects, which are very capital intensive. The electricity might be cheap and affordable in the long run, but you have to have a large chunk of money to get the project built in the first place. But there's been some good news here recently. So just last month, the World Bank reversed its ban on financing nuclear energy projects, which had effectively been in place for 50 years.
Wow.
And now more development banks, because a lot of them followed the World Bank's exclusion list for what they would finance and what they wouldn't, are considering lifting their bans as well. So this could actually open up significant financing for emerging economies who have also shown a lot of interest in nuclear. So I think we're going to see a lot more projects start to move forward in these countries.
Well, I'm glad we asked you that question. You definitely gave all the insight there that we needed. So thank you for sharing that. So how should we think about nuclear one more time in this landscape of renewables? Could they actually complement each other then, especially when we look at the different energy mixes across different countries?
Yeah, I think they definitely complement each other. And I think this is where we're seeing a maturity in the clean energy conversation. I'm seeing a lot more nuclear advocates talk really positively about renewables and vice versa. So there are tons of grid optimization studies or energy system optimization studies at the country and regional level that all find that including some amount of this clean, firm power, as I said, kind of reduces the overall cost and timeline for a deeply decarbonized energy system. But it also gets you higher penetrations of renewables. And I think that's a really good argument to have because renewables, they are really cheap. And so if you can have more of them on your grid, that does help bring down costs, but you have to have that right mix to maintain reliability. So finding, for your local grid, what resources do you have? What kind of demand do you have? And finding the optimal mix. And it's going to be different everywhere. But having some amount of nuclear actually does help you deploy renewables and maintain reliability and affordability.
Okay, so it seems like we are poised for investment opening up in nuclear in the United States, around the world. So it's an exciting time for those in the nuclear sector for sure. What do we have to get right going forward as we think about next generation nuclear and advanced reactors? What lessons can we learn from the past in this moment in time as we think about moving forward and avoiding old mistakes?
Yeah. So I have two lessons, and they're kind of going to seem contradictory, but the big lesson from the U.S. is that the U.S. did not have standardized design. We built all sorts of different reactors from all sorts of vendors and utilities and architect engineering firms, whereas in the countries that were very successful, you saw successive builds of a standardized design. And so that's kind of the first lesson is you can't build one-offs. You can't build nuclear like a mega project or a big infrastructure project. So I'd say nuclear companies need to focus on building out their order books for a standardized design so they can really invest in their workforce and manufacturing facilities and focus on learning by doing to drive down costs with successive builds. But on the flip side, we have, over 70 plus companies in the US working on advanced nuclear designs. And there's all these really promising technologies and companies doing really creative things with their business models, with their fuel cycle. And so the other lesson is that you don't want to down select the technology too soon. And I think that's another lesson from the US is that we kind of pushed into light water reactors maybe too soon and it wasn't the best technology. There was some technological lock-in. I think we want to have sort of the enabling conditions so that there's demand for this clean, firm power, and then companies can compete for whichever one has the best design, the best product for the market. And then they can succeed whether or not they bring down costs, whether or not they meet, their customers' expectations, performance, and things like that. But it's really about sort of building a fleet, not just a one-off project to be successful.
Got it. That's really interesting. Well, this has been really eye-opening. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for sharing that work with our audiences. I want to ask you one final question. So, if there's one takeaway for the audience that you would like to ensure gets expressed, what is that one misconception or oversimplification of nuclear that audiences may have as it relates to clean energy future that you wish audiences would better understand? Why don't you leave us with that?
Okay, I actually have two,
Shoot, great.
but I'll be short. So one, I think, and I touched on this a little bit, but one is that nuclear is slow to build, and an individual nuclear project might take a while, but it produces a ton of electricity for a long time, 80 to 100 years possibly. So one example, just from recently, is that United Arab Emirates started construction on their very first nuclear power plant in 2012. They were planning to build 4 reactors, and the fourth one came online, started generating electricity in 2024. That's They had a bit of a delay from COVID, but still, that's 12 years. In a very energy hungry country, they added 5.6 gigawatts. They went from 0% nuclear to 20% of their electricity coming from nuclear in just 12 years.
Wow.
That's really fast. You've never seen anything like that with renewables in terms of shifting the where a country gets electricity from. And we see that, historically as well, the fastest scale ups of clean energy or carbon free energy have come from nuclear. There's this example that I read recently. So in 1975, in Sweden, they had one large reactor under construction for every million people in the country.
Wow.
And what that would be like is if in the Bay Area you had like 8 1 gigawatt reactors under construction. Like 8 of these large reactors that we just built down in Georgia at the Vogel site, just in the tiny,
Sure.
population of the Bay Area. So that sort of huge scale was done in, 50 years ago, in a very small country. And so it's definitely doable back then, and it's doable more recently in countries that really kind of put their mind to it. And then the last little misconception I have, and that'll be quick, is that people don't want nuclear in their backyard or in their community. And it's complicated, of course, but what we see is that communities that have nuclear power in them are actually really supportive of the technology. And it's not a mystery or a surprise. It's because that power plant employs a lot of people. They have very high wages. The plant pays a lot of tax revenue. It funds the local government, the local schools. And they're just very good neighbors. And I think sharing that story is important. But what we're starting to see now is that it's not about like forcing nuclear into a community anywhere. No one's trying to do that. It's more that communities are asking for nuclear, particularly places that have coal power plants that might be shutting down or have shut down recently. And they're saying, hosting a nuclear plant looks pretty great.
Right.
We have a lot of experience with
Comparatively.
energy. We think of ourselves as an energy community. We'd love to be considered to host a nuclear power plant. And so it's a little bit different of a conversation in terms of what a host community is thinking about when they're considering hosting a nuclear power plant. So
Sure. Really
that's the
interesting.
last one.
Well, no, thank you for sharing that. Shows how perceptions are changing, and you're really just you're following this for the nature of your work and what you do, and we really appreciate you sharing your insights with us for the Future of Nuclear Energy series that we're hosting here at We Don't Have Time. And thank you, Jessica Lovering, Senior Fellow at the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. Really appreciated having you on. Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Great talking with you.